That's an emergency signal. I don't know if you're aware, but Jim and Pam have been married almost 32 years, and they met in Sandpoint, and they were at Connie's, and Jim was very, very shy. Being a California kid, he's very, very shy, and so he didn't know how to really get close to Pam, so a friend of his said, you know, Jim, what you have to do is take Pam for a walk and go out into the park and look over the lake and put your arm around her and just say, you know, Pam, when I look into your face, time just stands still. And Jim says, oh, I think I can remember that. I think I can remember that. So nervously, he asked her to go for a walk, and he walked slowly out into the park, and then he realized he had forgotten what to say. So the closer he got to the beach, the more he was fretting over what he should say. And finally he says, well, I know how to put my arm around her. So he put his arm around there, and there was a big moon over the water, and he says, you know, your face could stop a clock. Well, Brian's going to talk about parenting, and we want to know, how many of you here are grandparents? Your grandparents. There's a second question. How many of you want to be grandparents? Nancy and I rent grandkids. So how many of you are grandparents? Because this is a message on parenting, and it's helpful for Brian to know where you're all at. So, Brian?
Yeah, actually, this is one of those controversial topics, right? We talked about leaving your father and mother and cleaving to your wife. And this tends to be one of those areas where mom and dad maybe want to have more influence than they ought to have, and for them not to have influence in your life as you parent your children is to say that you think the way they did it was wrong, and that's not really comfortable ground to walk on, right? So because we have about an hour or so to get your children from the womb to marriage, I'm really not going to address all those issues. So really just want to walk through some basic principles of parenting, some fundamental stuff, and all of this could be expanded greatly, but we really just have so much time. So I did get to raise my hand about grandparents. My daughter's expecting her first child May 5th. So just a couple months from now, Lord willing, nothing goes wrong, I'm going to be able to hold a grandbaby. So we're pretty excited about that. I think my wife's probably more excited about it than I am. I'm not dis-excited about it. Dis-excited? Unexcited. I'm not unexcited about it. Where did dis-excited come from? But yeah, it is late. Yes. It is late. So, yeah, parenting is difficult, and we know why it's difficult, because our kids are sinners and we're sinners, right? So that is the essence of it. But the world's not doing us any favors either, influencing us and influencing them, and that's what 2 Timothy reminds us of. We talked about this earlier. In the last days, things are going to get ugly, and one of the things that he mentions is that children are going to be disobedient to their parents. Well, here we are in the last days, heartless, unappeasable, not loving good. There's all kinds of things in there, and that's part of the world that we're living in. But the comfort is that the scriptures are sufficient for parenting too, and that what our task is as parents is really the same task that we have as biblical counselors, if you want to put it in those terms. We're just trying to help our kids understand God and how to live in a way that honors God. And so in a real sense, you can take so many of the things that we've talked about getting to the heart and the process of biblical change and God's purposes for relationships and communication and all that stuff. And lead your kids through that. You really should. I've never had my kids sit in on the seminars, but I'm pretty sure my kids could repeat a lot of this stuff back to you. I know my daughter used to say, "You're only asking me that because you're a biblical counselor." And I said, "No, I'm asking you this because I'm a parent. And one of my responsibilities as a parent is to help you learn how to deal with the issues of your heart. And so I'm sorry if all of your friends' parents don't care about their child's heart, but I care about yours. Let's try to iron this out." And so that was a challenge. But over time, I think my kids have appreciated it more, and maybe that's in part because I talk different than I did 10 years ago too. So because I've grown, right? That's the problem with the first child. They get the immature parent, and then the next children get parents who have been more and more sanctified by the behavior of the older children. They're the kind of the guinea pig. Some of the things we did worked, some of them didn't. But that's part, and that's all part of the growth process too. We'll talk a little bit about that. So the scriptures are sufficient, and actually the Proverbs are so valuable in trying to help parent your children. I'm so thankful for my wife, who all of our kids spent at least some of their growing up years being homeschooled, and anytime they were involved in homeschooling, my wife would read through the Proverbs with them every month. So literally from September to May, they were reading the entire book of Proverbs every month. They'd read a chapter a day, and on Mondays they'd read 3, or 2 on Monday, 2 on Friday. So they'd get through the whole book of Proverbs every month, and it was really helpful with our kids. But that's really what Proverbs were. They were written in large part as a father to his son, parents to their children, and so it's directly meant to address issues that kids are thinking through at various stages of life. And some of what's in there actually talks about parenting and the consequences for not parenting and all that kind of stuff. So the clearest and most helpful description and definition of parenting is in Ephesians 6:4. And so we're kind of going to build our outline around this description and definition of parenting. I have heard people say, if this is all we have about parenting, if what we have for how to parent our children is Ephesians 6:4 in the book of Proverbs, we really don't have a lot to go on. And so teaching classes on parenting, how can you possibly come up with enough material to teach an entire class on parenting if all you have is this in the book of Proverbs? But the fact of the matter is that parenting is discipleship. And so really building into our kids a knowledge of God and a knowledge of the truth and a knowledge of how to grow and change and please Him, that's what the Bible's all about. So teaching him to observe all things that we commanded, and then thinking through what are the implications for that in the way that we deal with our children. So here's the description and definition. It'll provide an outline for us. Ephesians 6:4. Fathers, don't provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Fathers get directly addressed here. And that's not a mistake. It's not a coincidence either that our prisons are populated primarily by people who were rejected or abandoned by their fathers. That's not a coincidence. The role of a father as a leader, as an example, as an authority figure, it really can't be overemphasized. So ultimately, I think God, through Paul, addresses fathers because they are the ones who are responsible for their families. So they'll give an account for their families, much in the same way that church leaders will give an account for the souls of those that God puts in their care. Fathers will give an account for their children one day. And so I think God, through Paul, addresses fathers specifically and directly. But obviously mothers and fathers are in view here. If you look at chapter 6 there, it says, children, obey your parents. So both are mentioned in that context. And children are told to honor their father and mother. So he just simply is addressing the father as the primary person who's responsible. As the head of the home, he'll be held accountable ultimately for his leadership and whatnot. You see that pattern in Scripture. 1 Samuel chapter 3, Eli is held responsible for not rebuking his sons for their sin and for the cruel and immoral behavior they exhibited as adults. That's what God said to him. The Lord said to Samuel, I'm about to do a thing in Israel at which the 2 ears of everyone who hears it will tingle. I will fulfill against Eli all I've spoken and declare to him, I'm about to punish his house forever for the iniquity that he knew, because his sons were blaspheming God and he did not restrain them. New American Standard says, rebuke them. So everyone else involved in the training of your children are there to assist in the overall goal and product. That's mom, but that's pastors, teachers, coaches, employers, whoever else builds anything into the life and thinking of your children. They are there really to assist you, and you're there to kind of guide that whole process. And ultimately, no father's going to be able on the last day to blame somebody else for the failures of their children. Now, as I say that, I know everyone's thinking, you're saying fathers are to blame for every failure of their children, right? Well, children will bear their portion of the responsibility. Fathers will bear their portion. Yes, mothers too will bear their portion. And those who cause little children to sin, it'll be better if a stone be tied around their neck and they be cast into the sea, right? They'll bear their responsibility too. And so the degree to which you're responsible is the degree to which you'll be held accountable. There's a sense in which fathers need to just recognize the weight of that, not to let it be a great fear or an eternal burden, not to think of it as an unforgivable sin. If you weren't the best father in the world, none of us are, but to just recognize you bear responsibility. Some of those will be weighed out one day. Others we experience in time, right? A foolish son is a grief to his father and bitterness to her who bore him, Proverbs 17:5. And positively, Proverbs 10, a wise son makes a father glad. And so there's blessings and there's consequences in all of this. So that's also why one of the qualifications for spiritual leadership in the church is that he manage his own household well, right? And he has faithful children. So 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1:6, they talk about that. So it is a measure. It's not the only measure, but it is a measure of the spiritual qualifications of a man in the church. So what are the implications? Again, fathers. Why fathers? Well, because they're responsible. And two, if you're responsible, then, guys, we have to be available for our children. We have to be available for our children. You can't parent them if you're not there. Physically, mentally engaged in the process, emotionally engaged in the process, prayerfully engaged in the process, working together with mom if there's mothers and fathers. And obviously, single moms, they carry a different kind of weight in a situation like this, so you got to deal with that. I'm not going to address any of those issues, but single moms would carry a different kind of responsibility. And in the context of the local church, men in that church should be coming alongside that single mom, especially with the boys. But that's a big, broad issue. Responsibilities, there's certain kinds of responsibilities that are much more important at different stages in life. The issues you'll deal with your toddlers are very different than the issues you'll deal with your teens. And everyone, I think, understands that. And there may be seasons of life where you're going to have to be creative in how to do it, whether those, we talked about vocations and military issues as it relates to the marriage relationship. Some of that comes into play with raising our children as well. So in unique situations like that, the father just has to be carefully and prayerfully thinking through his responsibilities and doing what needs to be done to ensure that those responsibilities are being met sufficiently. Moms are a huge part of that. And at least in my home, a lot of the day-to-day parenting took place as a part of mom's responsibilities, not mine. And so children obey your parents, honor your father and mother. She's obviously a big part of that, but you being available and ready to not make her take more responsibility, not leave her to figure everything out on her own, you being involved enough to be helping her think through and make decisions about standards and whatnot, and you as the head of the home setting the tone for the home as well, a tone of service, a tone of good attitudes, of not being a grumbler and a complainer, etc. There's just so many things that come along with you being there, but also being a godly man when you are there. So all those things kind of flow out of the fact that Paul addresses the fathers. Here's, oddly, the first thing he says is, don't provoke your children to anger. If I were just thinking, what are the basic things we need to understand about parenting, I'm not sure that's the first principle I'd have come up with, but it's the first thing Paul says. Don't provoke your children to anger. First responsibility tells fathers there's something you're not to do. So what does that mean? Well, what it doesn't mean is that fathers will never or should never upset, annoy, oppose, anger, displease, or cross your child's will. Okay, if you think it means my child will never be disappointed with me, you'll be in trouble. Eli was held accountable for not crossing his sons, for not rebuking his sons, right? So provoking them to anger doesn't mean you're not going to disagree and cross them. As well, Proverbs 22 says, verse 15, foolishness, folly is bound up in the heart of a child. The rod of discipline drives it far from him. That's upsetting. However you put that into practice, it's going to be an upsetting experience for everyone involved. So, and Hebrews 12, talking about chastisement, really God chastising his children, that has a parallel with fathers chastising their children. That's what the writer of Hebrews says. We have had earthly fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them. Shall we not much more be subject to the Father of spirits and live? They, that is the earthly fathers, our earthly fathers disciplined us for a short time as seemed best to them. God disciplines us for our good, that we may share his holiness. For the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who've been trained by it. So provoking your children to anger doesn't mean that you and they are never going to have a painful experience together. That's not what it means. So what does it mean? It means that we shouldn't handle our children, parent our children, relate to our children in a way that they will be ultimately incited to a wrathful kind of living, that they won't grow up and become angry young men and women. So fathers, don't provoke your children. The Colossians 3 is a parallel. Fathers, do not provoke your children lest they become discouraged. So if your parenting method is leading them to a point of discouragement, right, then you're probably guilty of this provoking them to anger. They're building into them this settled resentment, and you need to stop and ask yourself, what do I need to do? The Amplified Bible kind of expands on that a little bit. It says, fathers, do not provoke or irritate or fret your children. Do not be hard on them or harass them, lest they become discouraged and sullen and morose and feel inferior and frustrated. Do not break their spirit. So that's just the Amplified Bible trying to bring some meaning into those terms, but I think that's a pretty good kind of description. So it's not so much a warning about particular incidents of children and parents getting angry or not getting along, but about a lifestyle that incites children to some kind of permanent anger, permanent resentment, bitterness in their heart. So the challenge is to not raise a Proverbs 19:19 child. A man of great wrath will pay the penalty, for if you deliver him, you'll only have to do it again. The kind of guy that just gets mad over and over and over again, and it doesn't matter how much you try to help them. They just stay mad. Proverbs 25:28, a man without self-control is like a city broken into and left without walls. Everything around him comes crumbling down. So we actually talked about different kinds of anger in the scripture back when we were talking about communication. There's a couple of different kinds of anger for our purposes in this here. The anger of open rebellion and anger of hostility. That's one. Open rebellion and hostility. So we saw that in Ephesians 4. Proverbs 14:7 uses the phrase a man of quick temper. So that's kind of the rebellious, hostile person. A hot-tempered man, Proverbs 15:18 says. But then there's also kind of the anger of passive resentment, and that may even be more in view in Ephesians 6 and Colossians 3, that passive resentment, that settled type of anger that expresses itself in apathy and stubbornness and indifference as kids get older, withdrawal, or just intentionally being subpar, not trying hard in school, not trying hard at home. That kind of just passive resentment for things. Perhaps similar to Cain in Genesis 4, right? Cain was very angry and his face fell, and the Lord said, "Why are you angry? Why has your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? If you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door." So I'm using that only as an illustration of a settled anger that just isn't going away, that kind of is reflected in their personality. So these kinds of anger, just a little chart in there for you to look at, kind of express themselves differently at different stages, and we don't really have the time to deal with all the ways in which you would deal with those, but when kids are younger, that more instantaneous anger expresses itself in the temper tantrums, and the really, really young ones, before they're able to give voice to things, will just arch their back and be naughty. We've probably all experienced that. Whoa, it's going to slip right out of there, little booger. As they get older, then they break things, they hit things, they yell, they kick, bite would be in there. And as they get older, then they're door slamming and running away, and that's where their rebellion expresses itself a different way. That more subtle thing is going to come out in different ways, not in rebellion against specific requests, but more of a settled, pouting, sullen spirit. You discourage a kid enough, and they're just going to withdraw, right? And so you criticize a young kid, a 3 or 4-year-old kid. You criticize them enough and just beat him down verbally. That's is potentially what happens. And I'm not saying every kid that might cry at small things is going through that, because there's personality issues as well. But so these are just kind of general patterns. So how do we do it? I put the whole list in here, and there's other places where you can get a list like this. And one of the best ones I've seen, and I didn't have time to transcribe it for us, but Lou Priolo, Priolo, Lou Priolo, has a book called The Heart of Anger, which is really helping you learn about anger and how to deal with children who have anger issues. He has a whole list in there, how parents provoke their children to anger. It's really good. It's bigger than this one, and it's very good, very helpful to read through.
He's an author that's very worth pursuing any of his books.
Oh, yeah. Yep. So how do we do that? Lacking marital harmony? Just, if you're marriage is a mess, then your children are going to be unstable, right? Nobody wants to be in an unhappy home. And so your kids may not be like consciously thinking that. It's just an unstable place, and so they emotionally are going to be unstable. Establishing a child-centered home is actually a way to provoke your kids to anger. And part of the reason that happens, if you run your home in a way that kids generally get everything they want, that can't happen, right? So if you try to give your kid what they want all the time, and they get accustomed to that, when the things of normal family life happen and they can't get what they want, they're going to get ticked, right? And that's what happens. So a lot of times when you're seeing temper tantrums at the grocery store, often that's what's going on. That kid is so used to getting what they want, and now they're in a situation where they can't get it, or the parents refuse it, and it creates this anger. So a child-centered home where kids just have to have measured expectations that they can't always have what they want, and parents need to decide what's good or wise. Third way, get angry yourself all the time, right? Kids learn from your example. So you want to have an angry child, be an angry parent. So even the way in which you parent them and discipline them, it can't be angry outbursts. There's ways to avoid that for you too. But Proverbs 22 says, don't hang out with angry people lest you be like them. I'm kind of paraphrasing it, but the Proverbs just basically tells us, you hang out with angry people, you're going to imitate them. You're going to learn how to deal with life similar to the ways that people around you deal with life. And so if you're an angry person, your children will probably be angry children. Fourth way, just being inconsistent with your discipline. So it could be different parental standards. When I say different parental standards, maybe mommy and daddy have different standards. That's not good. You're supposed to be one flesh. This is another area of one fleshness. You guys should really be working together. But then differing parental standards could be how you apply those standards to one kid or the other, right? And so that can create resentment. How come he gets that and I don't? Or how come he gets to do that and I don't? Now, I'm not saying that there aren't practical reasons to do that there might be some slight differences in the standards you have for different children, but there has to be a reasonable and biblical explanation for that, or your kids are going to be ticked. Then different parental enforcement. Mommy and daddy enforce the rules differently, right? When this happens, when dad's home, I get a spanking. When it happens when dad's not home, I don't. Over time, your kids just don't know what to expect. And again, it's not as though, especially young kids, are consciously thinking, man, my parents need to get it together because, I'm stealing cookies, but every time I steal a cookie, something different happens. And I'm getting kind of mad about it, right? That's not how it works, but they get a different response from different parents at different times, and it's just inconsistent. And eventually what happens is you finally get to the end of your rope, right? And then all of a sudden, the storm cloud breaks open, and the kid is like, what just happened, right? So now they just think that was really unreasonable. They don't know how to respond to it emotionally. It's really hard on them. It all goes back to just being consistent. So having a standard, communicating a standard clearly, enforcing the standard consistently, your kid knows what to expect. That helps him have emotional stability. So there's an expectation there. As they get older, those things, you actually talk about those things when they're old enough to understand. So number 5, being harder on their sin than you are on your own. We may not think we do this, but we do. In fact, our tendency is to recognize our own weaknesses in others better than we recognize them in ourselves, you start doing that to your kids, they're like, why? Why is that a standard for me, but it's not a standard for you? So we can't be harder on their sin than we are on our own. Similar to that, and I actually struggled with this one, is I would be harder on my kids than my counselees. My wife used to point that out to me. She'd say, you're being really firm with the kids about this issue, but I don't think you'd ever talk to someone in a counseling room like that. And I used to justify it and say, yeah, that's because I know what my kids know, because I taught it to them. That's how I would lie to myself and say it was okay for me to be not tender-hearted and not encouraging, not trying to help them. So that's kind of a corollary to that one, being harder on your children than you are on others as well. So I had to work hard at that one. It helps as your kids get older and they sin just like you. And and you realize, yeah, let's get it together. I mean, I can remember kind of having those conversations with my son. Let's get it together. We need to work on this. We both have this similar issue, so let's work on it. Number 6, not distinguishing between the law of God and the law of the house. Basically putting standards on your kids that God doesn't put on them, right? And pretending that the standards that you put on them are just as important as the standards that God puts on them. So we all need rules in our house, and there's a sense in which if I make a rule in the house, then children obey your parents. That makes it God's rule for them, right? But understanding that they're trying to honor God as they do this, God is the one that we're really answering to, not me, helping them think through that. You make your rules more important than God's rules, and they're going to have a messed up view of authority, and that's not going to be, not going to promote emotional stability in them. Failing to build a relationship with them, meaning there should be more times where you enjoy your children and are trying to bless and serve your children than times when you're instructing or chastising your children. There should be, right? That means you necessarily have to take the time to make that a reality. So they should actually enjoy you and enjoy being with you, and they should know that I have fun with Daddy. He's not just the heavy, for instance. That really shouldn't be the case. Number 8, abusive words, abusive expressions, tone of voice, those things. Those are unwholesome words. Ephesians 4:29, we talked about that. You tear your children down enough, and then eventually they're going to resent you. They're not going to look for encouragement from you. They're not even going to want you around. And you just think about extreme examples, and it's obvious, right? But it's easy for us, I think, as Christian parents. We're trying to have a orderly home and enforce certain standards, and we can lean that way without being totally extreme, and we need to guard ourselves from that. 9, that's fault finding. That comes out sometimes just with finding fault in our kids all the time, just being overly critical. Kids are kids, so they do stuff that kids do, right? So you got to let kids be kids, and again, there's times when some of the things kids do are dangerous, right? So that's not what we're talking about, but just constantly finding fault with what they do and talking to them in a way that's really not trying to help them, right? So you can scold your kid because they do something, but then the better way to approach it is say, okay, if you leave your bike in the driveway, what might happen to it? Right? So I can yell at them and say, I've told you time and time again, if I've told you once, I've told you 1,000 times. don't leave the bike in the driveway, right? But I want him to think through, no, there's consequences. There could be consequences that he's not thinking about if he leaves his bike in the driveway. I may run over it. Oh, what happens to the car if I run over your bike? I don't care about your bike. You can live life without a bike. But if I run over your bike with my car and it breaks my car, I can't drive my car to work, and I can't ride your bike to work either. So we're both in trouble. So just, helping them, not being overly critical, but trying to build them up. Not listening to the child's side of the story. That's the every man seems right passage again, until another comes down and presents his case. And my sisters, my older sisters, so I had there's 3 of them, and the 2 younger ones, like, purposely set up the older girl all the time. And she would get in so much trouble. And my parents were clueless. And they talk about it now. My parents have passed away. So, it's amazing that they're even friends, and they're only barely friends. Because when they were young, the kids, they were just mean, and they would get her in trouble. And, well, Valerie told us to la la la. And my parents would just believe them. And it was really rough. So, yes, there was a lot of anger and resentment for my oldest sister because the way my parents treated her and punished her for things that she didn't really do. So, making sure you hear people out. And sometimes somebody's lying and you don't know who. So what are you going to do? Punish them both? Are you going to do that? I'm not going to answer that question today. But you got to think through it and deal with it wisely. And like Solomon, say, "Oh, give me the baby. I'm going to cut it in half." If you can come up with a cut the baby in half solution, you're smarter than me. I can never figure those things out. Failing to keep your promises. Failing to keep your promises is going to engender resentment in your kids. If you make a promise, keep it, even to your own hurt, Psalm 15 says. Disciplining the child in front of others, that is so demeaning and condescending and humiliating, right? Just humiliating kids, not good. They're going to resent that. 13 and 14 go together, right? Give them too much freedom, give them too little freedom. Those are all measured by their degree of faithfulness and responsibility in their stage in life. So you give them increasing measures of freedom as they show that they're going to exercise those responsibly. That's important. And it's a weird time for that one in our world, I think. More and more parents don't give their kids a lot of freedom. And some of that's justified, and some of it's helicopter parenting, right? And number 15, not admitting when you're wrong. Not admitting when you're wrong. So my mom died having never said the words "I'm sorry" to me. So I'm not resentful about that. My sisters, however, who live with the same mom, haven't handled it the same way. So not admitting when you're wrong is just really, that's a bad recipe for bringing up happy, well-adjusted kids. So that's a sample list. Like I said, Luke Pirillo's, I forget how long his is. He might have 100 in his book. I forget. So I encourage you to read that. So don't provoke your children to anger, but instead bring them up. This is what he says, bring them up. You got any questions about the provoke to anger piece? All right, let's bring them up. Foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child. The rod of discipline drives it far from them. Kids don't grow up by themselves. It doesn't work that way. We all wish it did, but it doesn't. We'd like to just wind them up and watch it work, but it doesn't work that way. Bring them up. We talked about this earlier because the same word is used in another place to talk about we nourish and cherish our body. It means to nourish them to maturity, to nurture them, to rear them up. It's not confined to just physically, but includes every area of their life, their hearts and their will, everything that needs to be nourished, nurtured to maturity. The construction of this is, it's a command, so it's an imperative. It means it's not an option. You must bring them up. It's present tense, which means it's a constant, continual thing that you're to be doing, be bringing them up. And it's in the active voice. It means it takes effort. It's not something that's just going to happen on its own. So just in the way it's communicated in the text, you have to pay attention. Because it's an imperative, you have to recognize that the discipline and instruction of the Lord is not just one alternative among many to choose from. This is an imperative of God, so you need to understand what that discipline and instruction is and how to carry it out, because it's a task that you're continually involved in. As you will learn, no time of the day or night is off limits for what you will do. If you've had teenagers, or you're about to, if you've had teenagers, you know there's parenting that takes place after midnight. Why do kids open up after midnight? I want to go to bed. After midnight, they want to talk, right? Well, you can't miss those opportunities. Sometimes those are the raw, perfect opportunities to talk with your kids. And so no time of day is off limit. And again, the goal of parenting is in essence, it's to disciple them. It's to lead them to the knowledge of God and teach them how to live their life in order to please God by themselves, so that they can leave and cleave, right? Ultimately, that's the goal, is that they live a fruitful Christian life on their own, saved and growing. And that should remind us that parenting is God-focused. It's God-oriented. It's not parent-oriented, right? It needs to be God-oriented. Again, we could talk for an hour on the implications of that, but if your focus in parenting is relieving your frustration or producing what you want in the moment with your kids, you have the wrong focus. So getting to the heart of their problems and pointing them to God and to the truth of His Word needs to be where your mind and heart is oriented as well. And then making sure that you are dealing with things. That's the continual part. Bring them up. Be bringing them up, that thing. Preaching the gospel to them. Even though your kids aren't saved, this is another topic that's getting a lot of mileage out there right now, that we don't want to raise little Pharisees, teaching our kids to be a certain way on the outside when it's not a reality on the inside. Well, there's a reason to think that, and I understand the logic behind it. The problem is that people who are promoting that idea are not really thinking of the implications. I also don't want to say, I'm never going to force my child to do things on the outside unless it's the real desire of their heart. Also allows them to become little profligates, right? So they can do whatever they want. And no one's promoting that. It's just the implication of saying, in an effort to not raise little Pharisees, I'm going to allow them to develop sinful habits of thinking and living, right? So I'm trying to teach my children godly habits of thinking and living, ways to think and live biblically, knowing that they're not saved, perhaps, but also knowing that their inability to carry those things out truly from the heart expose their need for a Savior. So the law will lead them to Christ. So I'm not actually thinking, if my kids look good on the outside, that I've succeeded as a parent. because it doesn't matter if they look good on the outside when they're 7. Eventually, they'll be 17. And it'll look different, okay? So, but you don't want to foster an environment where they're allowed to develop habits of sinful thinking and sinful living, because that's not going to be good for them or good for your family. So, and if they do come to Christ, it's just going to be, they're going to have all those patterns of sinful thinking and living to overcome. So you're trying to teach them the right things so that it will lead them to Christ, and so that when they come to Christ, they'll have less sin to deal with. So, what does that mean? Where are we? Bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. What's the discipline? This is the training part of instructing a child. It's discipline, it's correction, it's discipline in the sense that it provides boundaries for children, boundaries that have penalties for going outside the boundaries, a system of rewards and corrections that ought to mirror and mimic the way in which God disciplines us, right? So Hebrews 12, when it talks about God's discipline, it says, we had fathers who disciplined us, right? And that whole image only makes sense as we think about the world that we live in and setting boundaries and training our children to understand them and live within them and experience the consequences of not doing so. And so, whoever spares the rod hates his son. He who loves him is diligent to discipline him. You set boundaries, they violate boundaries, there's consequences. Train up a child in the way that he should go. We help him understand the boundaries. Where are the boundaries on that path that we're trying to train them to follow? And what happens when they step outside of them? Foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child. The rod of discipline drives it far from him. That's part of the training process. It's only part of it. Do not withhold discipline from a child. If you strike him with a rod, he will not die. That's quite a phrase. We'll talk about that later. If you strike him with the rod, you will save his soul from Sheol. That's not a promise, it's a proverb, but an important one. So what's practically involved in discipline? All the different aspects of discipline. So it might be helpful to think of responding to your children's disobedience and failures to be a good little boy or girl in ways that help them think through their responsibilities and your responsibilities as well. And so these questions, these are the kinds of questions that I would walk my kids through when they were naughty, when they were disobedient. And so privately, what did you do? I want to make sure they know, so they have to answer me. Make sure they know what they did that was wrong. Was it right? What does God's Word say about it? So I might have to explain that to them, or that may be something they already understand. So I hit Billy in the nose. Okay. What does God's Word say about hitting Billy in the nose? Deuteronomy 25, if a man deserves to be beaten. I'm like, no. Wrong passage. I can't even figure that one out. So what's God's Word say about it? So you go, oh, this has got to be kind, right? And you were being, why did you do it is another question, right? Well, I wanted the truck. He wouldn't let me use the truck. What should you have done? I should have shared, right? Because God says to be generous with others, and you're teaching them passages of Scripture all the way. What are you going to do next time? How are you going to think through that next time? What does God expect me to do because you did this? What does God expect you to do because you've done this? So very simple questions. That's not the only way those questions can be worded. Those aren't the only questions that you might ask. But it's just kind of a basic skeleton of the kinds of things you should be talking through with your kids all the time. Just kind of a model to walk through. And it trains your kids to ask those kinds of questions too, as a pattern of life. So again, it's the same stuff that I do with counselees who are struggling with with lust or anger or anxiety? They're the same questions. I've just put them in words that a 4-year-old can understand. So if you can parent a 4-year-old, you can do biblical counseling, and vice versa. So part of discipline as well is establishing boundaries. So these are the rules and regulations of life in your home. Most of those, hopefully, are going to come right out of Scripture. We don't lie. We don't steal, right? But then there's other things that are kind of implications, and we call them house rules, and we tried to, as much as possible. The house rules were based on biblical principles. Sometimes it was just considering others was really the motivation behind some of these rules. And so you establish boundaries, and then they understand that if they violate the boundaries, they go outside the boundaries, that there'll be consequences. But when they stay within them, Deuteronomy, this was God talking to the people of Israel, if you are careful to do what the Lord has commanded, it may go well with you, and you may live long in the land which you shall possess. And if you step outside the line, I will kill you. No, that you want them to make sure they understand that there's blessing in staying in the will of God. So, and consequences when you don't. And again, you need to be, there's reward too. It's not just all consequence. If that wasn't on the list of how to make your children angry, make your only interaction with them consequences for wrong and never reward for doing what is right. It just shouldn't be that way. Second, not only set boundaries, make sure they understand them. Make sure they understand them. I would usually have my kids repeat them back to me if I thought they were not clear, or maybe I thought they weren't quite old enough or mature enough to think through it. Repeat that back to me. How are we supposed to do this? Also, kind of as a corollary to that, you should be on your children's side. So, I remember my kids love to leave their stuff in the driveway, in the yard. I've already expressed my growing resentment of the bikes. But, yeah, so they would just leave stuff laying all over the yard. And I had a lawn fetish. I don't anymore because I have a really tiny lawn. But I used to have a big lawn, and I liked it to be nice and pretty, and like 15 toys in the lawn. I didn't like that. So it's kind of an issue for me. But, so I used to scold the kids for that. And I realized one day I'm driving home from work, and it was a 15-minute drive, and almost the whole way I was rehearsing in my mind what I was going to say to the children when I saw the junk in the yard. And I got almost home and I thought, you are awful. You're just so evil. You're like planning ways to destroy your children verbally. You just spent 15 minutes thinking about how to tear them down. I can't believe it. And I felt awful and asked the Lord to forgive me, and realized I don't come across as being on their side. Like, I should be their biggest cheerleader for doing what is right. So I just started to rethink, what does that look like? So rather than think about how to tear them down, I would think, how can I encourage them to do right? So I would call in the afternoon and remind them what they were to do. Part of it, actually, that whole process was just repenting of being so anal about not having toys in the yard, because really? It's not that big of a deal. Does anybody else think that was a big deal? I don't even think it's a big deal now. So some of it was just repenting and my bad attitude, but just being on their side and making sure that things that were more important, that I encouraged them to remember those responsibilities, rather than kind of lie. I was like a crouching bear, right? I was just kind of lying in wait, waiting for them to fail so that I could scold them, and it was not good. So that's just making sure it's clear, and that as a corollary, you're on their side, you're for their success and blessing, not that guy that just wants to chew them out. Then enforcing standards, and here's an area where I think we have some problems, I think, in typical parenting nowadays. There's a lot of parents out there that do a lot of, I call it, I got this from somebody, a lot of parental yakety yak going out there. A lot of parents saying a lot of stuff to their kids, and their kids not really hearing it. Right? And they're like, don't do that. Johnny, mommy told you not to do that. 1, 2. It's just a lot of talk. There's a lot of stuff being said to the kids, and the kids are just continuing to do whatever, and the parents aren't doing anything. So I just call that kind of parental yakety yak. It really comes when the parents are not enforcing whatever standard that they've put on their children. And our children just need to know that you say what you mean and mean what you say. If you give them a standard, make sure it's clearly communicated, they understand it, and then you enforce it. My daughter's about to have a baby, and she and Michelle were talking the other day, and we had a little get-together at our house. That we heard a lot of parental yakety yak at our house on Sunday night, and Michelle was talking to my daughter about it a little bit, and my daughter says, "Well, how did you get us to just sit on the couch when we were over at someone else's house?" And Michelle said, "Well, I trained you to sit on the couch." "What did you do when I got off the couch?" We're laughing. It's like, you don't remember, do you? If the standard was clear and they violated the standard, we would spank them. And it was always clear. And our kids learned early the consequences of being rebellious, and that wasn't the way to go. And so she would do it. She did it, started when they were very little, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, and she trained them to sit there quietly and do what she wanted them to do. When they were really little, she'd put them on a rug on the kitchen floor so she could keep an eye on them. And that's where they had to stay with their little toys, and they learned to do it because she would help them learn to do it. And it's time consuming, but it taught them that what mommy said she meant, and that was the standard, and they got used to it. So instead of parental yakety yak, which is frustrating. I think part of the problem nowadays is that that's so typical that that's what's modeled for everyone. And so I think young families are really just imitating all the other young families, and there's not a whole lot of godly examples. And it's sort of a trickle down of the kind of way parenting books have been written for quite some time now. And so modeling is important. Unfortunately, it's not really true that parents with a lot of experience in those areas are still raising their own kids. And so, but I think modeling is an important part of that that's somewhat neglected. Training, so we're going to zip through some of this. We ought to understand what this means. We miss it. So this is all part of discipline, right? So bring them up in the discipline. Part of the discipline is setting standards clearly, enforcing standards. Part of enforcing standards is learning how to do that from others. Part of enforcing standards is training them. And this goes back to what we learned about in Timothy, right? Training in righteousness. And I talked about this last month, I remember. If your child says, "I want some milk," right? We're going to say please. But they're going to ask for milk the wrong way 100 times in their life. And 100 times in their life, we're going to tell them, what do you say? How do you ask? Right? And so we're training. That's part of the setting a standard and enforcing that standard. And not in a way that requires a spanking or anything like that. Just saying, this is training. This is what we're doing. We're walking them through it again and again and again and again. That's training. That's what training is. So that's part of what discipline involves. Then motivating them to do those things, giving them real clear biblical reasons as they get older. The things that we're asking of them have more to do with the heart and their motivations, helping them see this is part of honoring God. And then last, chastising them when When they fail, there needs to be consequences. And those consequences need to be, as Hebrews says, painful. For the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant. And so it needs to be painful. Some of that, corrective discipline, there's different forms. There's different ways to cause pain. I don't think that means it always has to be physically painful. So at times children experience just the logical consequences, and that can be painful. So if they abuse a privilege, the privilege is taken away. So if we told our son no more than an hour on the Xbox, and I go in there an hour and 15 minutes later, and he's still playing the Xbox, right? That 15 minutes is going to cost him a lot more than 15 minutes, right? So the privilege gets taken away. I'm not necessarily going to spank him for something like that. I get it. He's not paying attention. He's just having fun. He's a lover of pleasure like his daddy, but it's still going to cost him. And the privilege is going to be taken away. So that's kind of a logical consequence. Then at times, they'll experience the fruit of their own sin. They'll get stuck, and that will not be a good thing. The iniquities of the wicked ensnare him. He's held fast in the cords of his sin. I can just think of times in life where our kids did something and something happened as a result. And I just remember thinking, they've suffered enough. I don't really need to punish them. I think what just happened as a result of all that was punishment enough. Sometimes extra work. So here's kind of a classic: mankind falls into sin. God gives Adam extra work. So sometimes that's work. I'd be careful not to administer that as penance. Like, you're not saying you have to do this to pay me back for your sin. But at the same time, if I told you not to hit golf balls at the barn, okay? Like, you can hit balls in the yard, and I get it. You shanked one, hit it off the toe, but dude, there's like 100 dents in the side of the barn. Those weren't all accidents. The reason that one went through the window was because you were doing what I told you not to do. There's no way I'm paying for that window, right? He's going to work for that one. So sometimes just working and paying for the consequences is good. And then corporal punishment. When a child is deliberately defiant, disobedient, dishonest, spankings are appropriate. That's what the scripture says. Right? Don't withhold discipline from a child. If you strike him with a rod, he will not die. More and more, this is what I hear parents say. When I talk to them about chastising their children, they'll say, I tried that, it didn't work. That's what I have people say. That's actually the most common response I have when I try to talk to people about it. I tried that, and it didn't work. I've yet to talk to someone through that issue where I was confident at the end of the discussion that they were actually trying it properly and consistently. So it's probably not going to work well if you're not doing it well and you're not doing it consistently. So generally, my answer to that is we need to think through it. Secondarily, it kind of goes back to those guys in that Bible study years ago, right? We tried to love our wives. It didn't work. And I said the same thing to them. Why are you doing it? God doesn't say, do this if you think it works. God says, do this. Now, I think it works. I don't think God would tell us to do it if it didn't work. But he still tells you to do it. So you need to figure out what he means by it and how to do it. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Another way that chastisement comes to us is through the rod of men. I borrowed that phrase from somebody. But basically, what I mean by that is if you're a punk and you treat your friends like a jerk, you're going to lose some friends, right? And so, sometimes that's enough too. Your kids come home, they're crying, what happened? They tell you, and you're like, it sounds like you deserved it. I mean, you don't want to be that cold-hearted about it, but sometimes that's just reality, right? And so the rod of men sometimes gets us there. So backing up to the chastisement, I have in here some suggestions for use of the rod. So basically we're talking, this is like how to give a spanking suggestions, practical suggestions for what we did. Always instructing the kids clearly, because I believe that this should be reserved for direct defiance. Rebellious responses, disobedience, and we spanked for dishonesty as well. My thinking that was if they learn to be a good liar, they can get away with anything, right? So I didn't want them to learn how to be a good liar or to not fear being a liar. So direct defiance and disobedience and dishonesty. So we always wanted to make sure that they understood and we understood exactly why they were, what they had done wrong. Make sure they heard and understand it. So this is prior to the spanking. So I'm not going to give them a spanking if I wasn't clear, right? They disobeyed me, but I was, I keep hitting that. They disobeyed me, but I was kind of fuzzy in what I wanted. So clean your room. And I come back in an hour later, and they like straighten a few things, but the room's not clean. I'm going to feel like they disobeyed me, but I'm not going to punish them for that because I wasn't clear, right? But if I say, put the clothes in the hamper, put the trash in the trash can, and and I give them 3 clear instructions, and I know it was clear. And then I say, what did I tell you to do? The clothes, the trash, and the right? And I know they understood, and I go back in there, then that may be different, right? Maybe that's training, maybe it's disobedience. It kind of depends a little bit. But I'm just saying, make sure you give them clear instructions. When you do, one warning only. That's from Hunt for Red October. One ping. Okay. One warning, clear warning. Don't count. Right? Don't count. There's a really good little book out there called Don't Make Me Count to 3. It's a really good little book. I encourage everybody with young kids to get it. And it's very helpful. You can use that with young families here too. So your children should never think there's a protected zone where you're unwilling or unable to discipline them. That was what we tried to communicate with our kids. Saying 1, 2, said that the protected zone is I can do whatever I want until the count of 2 3/4, right? Because no one stops at 2. I've never seen anybody go 1, 2, 3. There's always 2.5. So there's no protected zone, and we would do everything we could in social contexts in public to make that clear with our kids too. And that can be really challenging, and you need to be really careful with that. This is another area where I haven't actually looked at the laws in the state of Washington. I knew what the spanking laws were in Vermont and New Hampshire, though. So you do need to understand what the boundaries are for which you can get in trouble and which you can't get in trouble. Always discipline the child alone. Actually, Ecclesiastes 8, because the sentence against an evil deed is not executed speedily, the heart of the children of man is fully set to do evil. That's a great parenting verse. You want to set your child's heart fully to do evil? Count. I mean, that's not exactly what it's saying, but... then discipline them alone, always alone, having those conversations with them, right? That kind of like I outlined earlier, those questions so that they know what's going on. Explain the spiritual issues involved, not just what they did, but what their heart issue was. Express grief. It should break your heart. There shouldn't be any pleasure in disciplining your children. If there is, I hope your spouse notices it and rebukes you. It's really awful if that's the case. Then this is just a practical thing. Use a neutral object. That's what we did. Something that's flexible and has a wide striking area. These are just practical things so that you can sting but not bruise. So inflexible objects can bruise your kids. I don't think you want to do that. I'm pretty sure you don't want to do that. So something that just stings, and try it out on one another, and you'll find some implement that can be used for that purpose. I do think, again, that discipline needs to be painful. So when Proverbs says, if you strike him with a rod, he will not die, just think about the implications of that. The guy who's writing the Proverbs is saying, there are going to be times in the process of disciplining your children where you're going to question whether you should go that far. Right? Not that far, right? So he's getting our attention by using this amazingly graphic phrase, he won't die, right? So don't beat them to the point of death and go, God promised, I don't know what happened. But he's definitely getting our attention, as if to say, there'll be times where you'll wonder, man, is this really necessary? Is that too much? And so you need to know what that is. The same parent who disciplines should be the parent who comforts and teaches the child. There should be no good cop, bad cop. That shouldn't be going on. My kids didn't have to wait until their father got home. Thank goodness. And I wouldn't have allowed that anyway. Then help your kid clear their conscience, right? So this is a time to confess sin and to confess it to one another and to you and to reconcile and hug. That shouldn't be, the issue should be fully dealt with when it's over. And that's one of the beauties and one of the reasons why I don't think chastisement provokes our children to anger, because they learn how to find the joy of the Lord in confessing and forsaking their sin, right? So the one who hides his sin will not prosper, but he who confesses and forsakes it shall find mercy. They're going to know that joy that comes through experiencing God's mercy and your mercy and forgiveness. So instruction, oddly enough, at the end of a seminar on biblical counseling, I didn't put much in there because we've already talked about that so much. Instructing our kids is just like instructing our counselees. I'm teaching my kids the same things. I admonish them when they're unruly. I encourage them when they're faint-hearted. I help them when they're weak. I'm patient with them all the time by God's grace. And my goal is to present them mature in Christ. So teaching them biblical principles and how to live them out is really what you're doing. And different principles are more important at different times in life. Some, when they're toddlers, they just need to learn how to be honest. When they're teenagers, they need to learn why they shouldn't flirt, right? So what you do in bringing them up in the discipline and instruction is different at different stages of life. But it's basically teaching them the scriptures and helping them learn how to live it out. So that's good. I kind of went late. Questions? Yeah.
Just looking at the full circle of this, and just thought, this verse just hits at home. It's just like if we're teaching our kids wisdom and growing them up in maturity in Christ, when we look at a lot of the issues that we have with the counselees, it's because they're immature in Christ. So we're going to keep people out of the counselor's office.
Right.
It's just neat.
Yeah. All right. We're going to watch another counseling session here in just a little bit. So let's take a little break, and I think we're going to scoot into the auditorium.